And welcome you to today's conversation. We have very special guests with us today, and we're going to get into a subject that is very touchy and very important. And this idea of how has purity culture been something that has affected how people grow and develop in their lives as Christians and in their marriages as Christians. And so we have Lauren Peterson with us today. Lauren is a therapist pursuing independent licensure and practicing with strength and serenity counseling. Her current areas of focus include couples counseling, sexual addiction, and Christian sex therapy. Lauren is pursuing certification in sex therapy, Christian sex therapy, and is under the supervision of Dr. Jennifer Konzen. Love Jen. She spent her first few years after receiving an undergraduate degree in psychology as a campus minister, then youth and family minister. She then pursued her master's in social work at Loyola University and went into clinical practice. She lives in the Quad Cities with her husband, Craig, and three children, Eliana, Kale, and Inya. They serve as children ministry leaders in the Quad Cities Church of Christ, and they co-own 3 dental practices. Lauren, welcome to the channel.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Absolutely. I'm so excited. And for those of you that don't know, this is one of those subjects that, and I know for many of us, we have different narratives. Some of us, we became a Christian and then we dated. Some of us, we came into, a relationship with God, but we were already married. And so there's a lot of diversity that I just want to start with, that I'm kind of just wanting us to be aware of, that we want to acknowledge that a lot of people have different stories. So anyway, tell us a little bit about your conversion and why you decided to go into, there was ministry and then there was counseling.
Yeah, sure. So I became a Christian in college, was a junior in college. And I pretty quickly just felt like, man, ministry is my calling. This is what I want to do. So I was getting my undergrad in psychology. I think from, the sex therapy perspective too, I think one of the things that I loved when I studied the Bible in college and became a Christian was just seeing the authenticity, the fact that no topics were taboo. When I was studying the Bible, we talked about everything. That was probably the first time that I really heard someone hash out sexuality from a biblical perspective. Just any talk about sex at all. And it was really powerful to me. And so I just loved what just really felt like a lack of hypocrisy. And so wanted to, go into the ministry and help as many other young, kind of jaded, I'm part of this generation that's kind of jaded in church, wanted to help all the other jaded 19 something, 20-year-olds, kind of see that there are people out there who genuinely want to live the Bible Monday through Saturday. So then I was in the ministry for a while, loved it. Was in the ministry in Columbia, St. Louis, beautiful places, loved my time in the ministry. I did feel like, though, when I was helping people, I kept hitting kind of a wall, like I kept hitting like a ceiling, really, like my skill set kept hitting a bit of a ceiling. And so the seed kind of started growing. Let's go back to school. Let's get our master's. My husband and I got married in St. Louis. We moved to Wisconsin for his first job. I stepped out of the ministry when we made that move, got my graduate degree from Loyola Chicago. And then, we had some dreams to stay home, and I was going to stay home for a few years and we have 1 million children. And God had different dreams for us. We experienced secondary infertility. We tried to get pregnant for 5 years. And again, this theme of sexuality kind of came into my walk with God, because nothing kills a sex life like infertility. Like tracking your ovulation is pretty difficult to keep the fires lit. So I was like, man, kind of starting to reckon with this theme of sexuality again. And then COVID hit. My husband's office was shut down. We had just adopted 2 children within within really 1 calendar year. It was crazy. And we decided, you know what, one of us has got to be working. So I went back to work. And the agency that I worked at, it's a national Christian counseling company. And the CEO had this vision, like, you know what, the church has really, and not a specific fellowship, but really the greater Christian church has really failed a lot of married couples in the sense that we don't talk about sex nearly as much as we should. So he encouraged all new clinicians to dip their toes in this thing called Christian sex therapy. And so I did it and I fell in love. And even as I've shifted to a different practice, I've just continued pursuing that because it has just been such an incredible journey to help couples heal in that area.
Yeah, I think you're well suited. I find that it's important to have a merge for folks as we're talking about faith. Sometimes it's helpful to have someone who was in the ministry, someone
Mhm.
who gets the culture of trying to help shepherd people to have their best lives. And so
Right.
you get that, but you also get that clinically. And you also know what it's like to try to use, you kind of know where your ministry skills and where your clinical skills, where those kind of at times hit their walls. And so I just think you're uniquely qualified to help us to have a little bit of a conversation around this today. I want to start out with a basic understanding of purity culture in the church. And I mean the church in terms of just Christendom, right? I don't just mean one specific fellowship, because this is something that actually, when you look at it as a series of reactions, it's something that's actually pervasive throughout Christianity. It's not just one fellowship or one strain of
Yeah.
heritage. Give us a little bit of an understanding of purity culture as it relates to church.
Yeah, sure. So purity culture actually kind of was this movement that started kind of in the 80s, purity rings and virginity pledges and, Joshua Harris, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, just kind of this big movement. And it was interesting because it pretty quickly morphed from, let's just all make a pledge of abstinence to let's create all of these kind of rules and norms around dating, around sexuality, around how we view ourselves, how much we talk about sex. And then it has just kind of grown and morphed. I'm not actually a huge fan of the purity culture term. I think it's a bit of a misnomer because it makes it seem like, when we say there's a purity culture is a problem, right? It makes it seem like we're saying either purity is the problem or a culture that's a proponent of purity is a problem. And I don't think either of those things are true. I think from a biblical perspective, having a culture that upholds and elevates purity is great. I think, purity in and of itself is great. Obviously, that's God's vision for us and our bodies. But this purity culture refers to kind of three different prongs. Okay, at least the way I see it play out currently, not like in the 80s, but currently now. It pertains to like three different prongs. So the first can be this kind of theme of like less is holier, right? So the less you touch, the holier you are. Like if you're dating, the less you have to talk about sex with the person who's mentoring you, the holier you are, the less it's an issue, the less arousal you feel, the holier you are. Another prong of purity culture is this generalization of rules for people who are either single, dating, or engaged, right? So we don't necessarily, in this kind of purity culture movement, it would mean that we don't necessarily help people go from, single to dating and then go, okay, what's the Holy Spirit putting on your heart? What do you need in order to stay pure? We create these general rules. And there's a reason we do it because it's easier. It's easier just to have rules, of course. And then another problem that I see really play out now is this really, and this is the one that I get most excited about because I think it's probably the easiest to solve, the quickest to solve, is this lack of positive education about sex. We have lost this vision of a sex positive God. And so those are kind of the three ways that I see it really play out in larger Christendom now.
I appreciate the three pronged. I feel like sometimes we need something that's concrete. This subject almost feels abstract because you're talking about something that so many people have different experiences with, that
Yeah.
trying to explain to them or even just name, I think sometimes just naming it brings some clarity. And I feel like that three-pronged approach, especially the last one, the sex positive narrative, is something that God has so many big feelings around too. Anyway, I like that you've just given us some concrete language for that. What are some ways that you have had to help people to work through issues that were either exacerbated or caused by the effects, or let's say the intentions of purity culture?
Sure. Well, and I appreciate that you're making it specific to my clinical experience because I am in no way an expert on purity culture or purity theology or anything like that. I'm excited to speak to what I've seen in my four walls and what I know in my experience. But of course, purity culture is this incredibly broad term that can involve clothing and self-image and body issue, all kinds of things. But for my work, and in my experience clinically, I have seen couples come through the door where neither are able to access arousal because they have spent years shutting it off, right? As opposed to, well, we'll get to the solutions later. But so that's how I see it present. I see struggle with arousal. I see a lot of body shaming, body hatred. I see a lot of disgust at sexual attention, right? Like a lot of wives who, because of some of the messages that we've either implicitly or explicitly received, wives that internally feel like their husband's attraction to them is gross, right? They can't receive that in a loving way because they've been told their whole lives, if men are doing that, you're probably being immodest, or you're putting off something to attract that, and that's simple. And our bodies are not light switches, right? We can't just switch them on and switch them off. And that's been part of the problem. Is I have couples that come in and they go, man, we were pure. We didn't even hold hands. We didn't even kiss until we got married. And then we got married and get to our wedding night and, well, that sucked. And okay, well, that's understandable. Sometimes that happens. But then we're 1 month down the line, 6 months down the line, a year down the line, and the wife's body is still responding as if she was sexually abused because it will not turn back on. Like she is feeling repulsed at his sexual touch. Any sort of initiation feels gross to her, literally physiologically, maybe when he touches her, her skin feels prickly. She has this, desire to push him away, and oh my gosh, it crosses the gamut. It's heartbreaking because at the end of the day, they're not really wrestling with each other, and they're not even really wrestling with me. They're wrestling with God. And it's hard to watch. And then I've got individuals, of course, struggling with sexual addiction, struggling with all kinds of things, that this kind of internal messaging of my arousal is shameful, my arousal is sinful, actually perpetuates their addiction.
Well, I think you're mentioning something that's very important for our listeners, and this is something that applies to everyone, okay? We all have what's called an arousal template, and you are literally hitting on this arousal template without even saying that, but that's what you're hitting on. And this is kind of what's hard, is some of it's something that gets wired, some of it's already there, right? It's nature versus what's cultivated. And your arousal template kind of starts out in life. Then we go through things that affect our arousal template. And there's many different permutations for how our arousal template can evolve. Right. What's interesting is, there's abuse, there's trauma and all of that. What's interesting is that, again, when you talk about neurology, neurons that fire together wire together, right? Things that should go together. Things that shouldn't go together don't go together. The problem is something like trauma, something like consistent messaging, right, around feeling badly about how you're wired, can create a little bit of an issue later on. And now all of a sudden we have these pairings that we shouldn't have, right? So in other words, I'm now in a situation where I can express myself sexually, right? I'm not single anymore. I can share this with someone. And it's like you said, that arousal template isn't something that just all of a sudden can trigger in another direction instantaneously. And that could create quite a bit of issues in terms of just, I'm just going to say it, trauma, right? Because now all of a sudden wedding night, that can become a real sore spot for someone. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like that was your, and then we build that up. And then it's like, oh my gosh, all these damaged self-concepts. So I just really appreciate you kind of getting into that concept of the arousal template. And we kind of have to protect it and nourish it and cultivate it. Yeah.
And it's tricky. And, I'm a mom, I'm a parent now, I have 3 kids, and oh man, it is, the rubber meets the road when your kid hits 7, 8, and you really got to start having these really intense arousal conversations. You're like, oh my gosh, do I really believe what I'm teaching here? It is not comfortable. it's the harder path, I believe, to acknowledge the, yeah, that arousal is good and holy and wonderful. It's so much harder because it involves so much more, honestly, prayer and conversation. And yeah, I don't, being in the ministry, I definitely want to make it clear. I don't fault anyone for where we've been and some of the things that we've perpetuated, but I just think we can move forward. Like any family, there's good parts and bad parts. And I think that we have an incredible opportunity to grow in our sex positivity. And the reality is that if we choose not to, right, if we choose to just kind of continue on, I have women that come into my office who, because of their internalization of, their body is shameful, arousal is shameful, sex is sin. And maybe nobody told them sex is sin, but because of some of the things that, the environment they grew up in, that's what they internalized. And I can't argue with that. I can't say, well, nobody told you that, right? Because I can't argue with someone's trauma. This is what they experienced. So because of all that, sometimes they even experience what's called vaginismus, which is where the muscles literally reject penetration, making sex incredibly painful. And sometimes that does not go away for a very, very long time. And it's heartbreaking. And honestly, I wish, because when I was in the ministry, I think I was just so scared of the people that I was working with. I'm just terrified of them engaging in sexual sin because I knew how damaging it was from my life before I became a disciple. And now that I'm a parent, I'm also equally terrified that my daughter and my son and my youngest daughter are going to engage in sexual sin because I know how damaging it can be. But I think the solution is not the other end of the extreme, right? Because that causes its own damage.
Let me ask you even some more specific questions, because I feel like you really are someone who is very skillful at dealing with delicate, specific situations. One of the trends that we like, so here's the normal story arc for kind of what we would try to help people to achieve, which would be, you're going to become a Christian. You are going to swear your allegiance to Christ, and you are going to have healthy relationships with the opposite sex. You're going to go on, let's say, dates, or you're going to go on group outings where you're all together. And we try to keep people to a point where, they're around people, and it just increases that social accountability. And let's say maybe you start taking an interest in someone, and then maybe they have a spiritual mentor. And so you go and talk to them because you're like, hey, where's this person at? And then maybe that spiritual mentoring process helps the two people to connect, or maybe it doesn't. And then you have this aspect of, okay, we're ready to date, or we're ready to get engaged. And there can be a little bit more of a permission or permissive aspect of, okay, we have people that we really trust. And trust is good. Healthy people trust. Healthy people risk. Literally. People, and so anyway, we do that. And maybe you hold hands. Maybe that's all you do. Maybe you save your wedding kiss to the, to your kiss to the wedding day. And then all of a sudden on your wedding night, it's supposed to just be fireworks.
Right.
And so I've just given you a little bit of this narrative of almost two people that there's just a lot of, I want to say it feels phony, but there can be just a lack of connection between two people as they are growing towards marriage. So I'm just kind of interested in your take in this story arc and where we could maybe help people in that process.
Yeah. So I think working backwards, first and foremost, if you are a person who is married and is going, I feel like I'm married to a stranger, or is going, sex is not enjoyable. Okay. Find a Christian sex therapist, because it is not okay. It's not normal, and you don't have to suffer alone. There have been disciples I've talked to who've been married for 35 years and have never enjoyed their sex life. And that's not unique to Christendom. That's unique to America, to the world. I mean, it's just an unfortunate reality of sexual health, but you don't have to suffer alone. Okay. Then I think another place that we can interject, working backwards, is in that, engagement, dating, when we're setting up, called boundaries, making sure that when we have those conversations, that they're not generalistic, that they're not prescriptive, right? That they're spirit led and that they're sex positive, that the goal of those conversations is not how can we date and avoid being aroused by each other. That is not a healthy goal because the reality is that if you are in love and you are attracted to that person, your body is going to be on fire. And that is okay. That is okay. That is not the same as lusting after that person. And, we're not talking about like going home and masturbating after a day. I mean, none of those things are the same. But feeling arousal when you are around the person you love is very normal, and not training people to shove that down. Because again, when we get to the wedding night, can't always turn it back on. Some people can, but not everybody can. The other place we interject is when we're single, right? Working backwards, having these sex positive conversations with singles. Honestly, I think we avoid the conversation unless someone tells us they're struggling with pornography or masturbation.
Absolutely, without
That
question.
was my tendency. Like I didn't really want to talk about it unless it seemed like it was a problem for somebody. And still is my natural tendency outside of my office, right? I love talking about sex in my office, but I find it's still hardwired in me, just growing up in the society I grew up in, not Christianity, but just American society. We just don't talk about it. So we avoid it unless it seems like a problem. No, when we're single, it's important that we hear, what, when you feel arousal, when you feel that energy in your body, that is a gift of God. You are operating as designed. Let's talk about where to channel that energy, right? So that we don't channel it in 4 ways, but that energy being present is good. And we don't want to stifle that. We don't want to think baseball, 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 because someday it may shut off and we may not be able to shut it back off.
I love the way you're talking about as far as let's drop people into, let's kind of deploy people with an understanding that when you're married, you got to work backwards. And when you're single, you have to think in terms of longevity and prevention even, and how you're wiring people. I will say this, and I feel to our listeners who are single, I really, and I mean this, I really have a ton of compassion because in a lot of Christian circles, being single is the hardest life stage. And you don't really know when it's going to end, and ministry doesn't equal chemistry, and there's all these different things. And I find that if you could just maybe encourage some of our singles for a moment, because I don't think they get enough. They don't get enough attention. They don't get enough of really anything. And especially when you get married, you kind of just forget about that sometimes. Like it's like, oh, out of sight, out of mind. Go back to that piece with preparing people when they're single, right? You can be single as a campus student. You can be single as a 40-year-old who's been through a divorce. There's a diversity as it relates to the experiences that people have. What encouragement do you have to those who are single and they want to understand themselves sexually? Because that feels like you said, that's a tightrope dance. When you're single, it's like, you're not supposed to acknowledge anything sexual. And that's not true. That's not what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think too, words like arousal, that can be really scary. So you're like, what does that mean? Arousal versus lust. And that's where I think we don't want to get caught in the theological weeds. I think the point is acknowledging that, sexuality is natural and healthy. And I would encourage anyone who's single, who's kind of stuck in that place, like just so frustrated, even with their own body, first of all, to resist the urge to feel that your body is the enemy. That your genitals are only just used for temptation right now, and you just deal with them as little as possible until we're married. Just resist the urge to see your body as the enemy, because it's not. It's a temple. And then honestly, there's some really great resources out there. Jennifer Konzen and her husband Tim Konzen, or Dr. Konzen, excuse me, have a book out called Redeemed Sexuality. It's great. Doug Rosenau, who's an incredible Christian sex therapist, has a book called Soul Virgins, which I really love because he talks a lot about channeling sexual energy to places that feel healthy. And I would honestly encourage parents to get that book as well. That's a great book to kind of start this conversation with your adolescents. And I say that purposefully, not teens. We do not want to have these conversations when our kids are 15. We want to have them when our kids are 8,
Thank
9.
you.
Yeah, unfortunately, the average age of viewing pornography for a male right now, I think, is 8. For a female, I think it's 11. And so we really, as disciples of Jesus, we want to be the first people, the first line of conversation for our children.
So I just, there's so much that you're saying that is I love what you're saying specifically around your body is not the enemy.
Right.
And I think this is something, this is kind of my deeper, my research that I really want to get into at some point is biblically, what does it mean to be human? And this idea that Jesus was not ashamed of his humanity. And God is not ashamed of our humanity. He made us human and human image bearers. We're to image him with our humanity. And so it's, wow, that gets into a whole nother thing. But just that idea, we don't need to be ashamed, even as singles, and even the body shaming that can start with kids. As we try to help them with good touch and bad touch, and then we start to just, to your point, because we're so fearful, train them to look at sex as bad. Well, here's the problem with that. When you think about arousal template, what happens is sometimes sex, in order for sex to be good, sex has to be bad. You got to be really careful. And you see this as a sex therapist, just that idea of people's arousal templates can get inverted, where the only thing that turns them on is the devious. What turns them on are these crazy fantasies that just, because that's how it gets sort of wired together. And so I just think even as kids and as we move up, just the body, and then for females, I think this is a whole nother podcast, but there's already so much body shame and pressure for females. Right. Then let's add that. And so anyway, I think you're hitting on so many very important points.
Yeah, I mean, it can really, oh my gosh, it can go so many places.
Yeah.
I've got couples that, they had mostly pure dating relationships. They had, a couple what they would call mess ups. Yeah. Okay. And because of the rebellion that was associated with that the dopamine hit was huge. Yep. Right. Then they get married. There's no sense of rebellion, which is what their arousal template, that's the only thing their arousal template has created. Now, they can't, and this is a problem I see more with males than females, is that, now they're really struggling to find their desire because there's no sense of rebellion. And when we do not dominate the conversation with sex positivity, we leave it to rebellion.
Wow. Wow, that's powerful.
Because then that's where the dopamine hit's going to come from. And yet we ask people to, and the Bible asks people to be in these righteous relationships where there is no rebellion, right? It's all, we're a unified team, we're faithful to one another. It's holy and righteous. And it's really heartbreaking when the body's not able to enjoy that the way it's designed to.
I like what you're bringing in now with the neurochemicals. I think sometimes some of us, just for our audience, I know fancy terms, medical terms can be something that makes you want to fast forward. Let me just say for a moment that it's really important to understand how our bodies work and what Lauren's talking about. And because if you, let's take dopamine. Part of even when you take pornography is so pernicious because it doesn't just affect dopamine. You have this cocktail of adrenaline. So for a lot, especially Christian men, it's really lethal because what it does is you get the dopamine, but when you mix dopamine with adrenaline, you have an enormous nuclear problem internally. And so that's a great example. The other thing is I think for males, I think there's a ton of shame around arousal. Men have on average 20 to 40 times as much testosterone as females. It's a lot. Testosterone is a very visual chemical. So for a lot of men, they're constantly being bombarded. And so it's so easy, especially as a man, to, sex positive talks with men, it's almost non-existent, Lauren. So that's something that I'm wondering about just in terms of helping men. How have you helped men to develop this sex positive thought process?
Yeah, well, honestly, a lot of the work when I've worked with sexual addiction, one of the first things that we do if I have someone who comes in who's addicted to pornography, is we go back, okay, tell me about that first disclosure, right? The first time it was discovered. And there's usually a lot of shame involved, a lot of, understandably, right? The pornography industry is a disgusting industry, right? And so they have so much shame that they've engaged. And that, a lot of times it's their parents found out or something. And so then there's this conversation with their parents that's really traumatic. And what we do is we start doing some memory reprocessing, right? Where we can kind of separate the shame from that memory. And then as we're able to do that, we're able to make some space for a new narrative that doesn't feel quite so triggering, right? A new narrative that goes, your body is God-given, arousal is God-given. And when we feel that energy, what can we do with it, right? But honestly, I find that my clients that come in with sexual addiction, and this is true of any addiction, their ability to process any emotion is so stunted. So, honestly, that's a lot of our work too, is we start to grow their emotional tolerance in all emotion across the board. And I find that's what's so interesting about it is sexuality is ingrained in who we are as humans. It's part of God's design. When we stuff that, there are consequences across the rest of our personhood, right? It's a part of creativity. It's a part of love. It's a part of all these things. And just like Brene Brown's work on shame and vulnerability, you can't, individually silence certain emotions. You can't individually silence certain parts of who we were created to be. There are consequences. And I think to your point earlier, I want to circle back to the kids thing, because I think it does with, the good touch, bad touch. It starts with early conversations with our really little children. And again, I don't claim to be an expert in any of this, but what I've learned as I've sat at the feet of really wise Christian sex therapists is that one of the best things that you can teach little children is that, for girls, that their vagina is clean, right? That it's not dirty, that there's good, and go from a science perspective, there's great bacteria in there, it's great. The butt, dirty. Vagina, clean. Right? And then we see that literally grows into this sexual theology, right? It's crazy how God designed it. Because if you think about healthy sexuality and healthy sexual behaviors, right, that grows into that. So it starts at this really, really young age. This is clean. This is good. There is nothing wrong with this. Yeah, when you touch that, it feels kind of funny, right? That's kind of funny how God did that. Isn't that silly? Yeah, it's so cool. We'll talk more about that when you're older, but for now, just know that that's clean, right? That's literally the conversation I have had with my children and plan to have with all my children at the age of 3, 4, because that's when they start experimenting, and that's when parents start freaking out too.
That disgust psychology is strong. There's a book by Richard Beck, Unclean, and he gets into that, how we start being wired for disgust psychology very early, and it's wide sweeping. It's more caught than taught at times even. Mm-hmm. And so I love that you're getting into that, because trauma is one of those things that it gets in and it gets connections made at a very deep level that are they're very durable throughout a person's life. It's actually kind of there's a part of your personality that you never completely rewire. And right. to your point, I love where you're kind of bringing the connections from even the kidhood. Let me go back to this narrative, because this narrative of this story, and it's an amazing story. You can get married. It doesn't matter. Let's say you've had a horrible childhood or you're promiscuous, and you can become a Christian and you can start over.
Yeah.
Now, here's my question. Let's say someone gets into a dating relationship, and we have this thing where they're impure or they're immoral. Impure is where you're basically doing everything but sex, and immoral is where you have sex. And I'm sure people would label that differently, but then you mess up and you lose your story. My question at that point is, when people feel like they lose their story and you kind of lose it wholesale. And what I mean by that is, to some degree, is comparatively, we kind of lift up people who have these impeccable dating relationships. Right. What we don't lift up is the pain and the backstory of what happens next. Sometimes wedding night, we don't really, but we lift people up, and we should, for being pure. But then there comes this point where if you can't live up to that, and you, that's not your story, then how does that affect your sense of self and your ability to feel like you're lovable and you're not too damaged?
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think there's multiple factors here. I think the first is that we do need to really, man, I think if we could be careful that we don't elevate sexual sin as worse than other sins, we could really help people reintegrate themselves back into their story, right? And that's something that that purity culture talks about is, this incredible amount of fear that we have to fall into sexual sin, right? Because it is the unforgivable area of sin, and that's just not God's heart, right? Like we know that it's not an unforgivable sin. And so I think the more that we can perpetuate that language, like that there is no sin worse than other sin, right? And I mean, you can have the blasphemy theology argument, but I think that helps people reintegrate their story. The other thing that I think is, to your point, you get baptized and you start over. I think, honestly, I think that's really true from a salvation perspective. But sometimes I think helping people understand your history with your body and with sexuality is still part of your story,
Absolutely.
right? And it's not that you got washed clean from your sin and you lost your history. You got washed clean from your sin and you kept your history. And it's all a part of your beautiful journey toward healthy sexuality. And yeah, so I think those are kind of two things we can do to help people who feel like, man, I lost my story. I blew it, right? I had this chance at perfect purity and I blew it. And the reality is this idea of perfect purity is not real, right? It's not real. There's no one on the face of the earth other than Jesus who was perfectly pure.
I appreciate you saying that, because this concept, like part of what we're kind of getting into in a way, is this idea of permission. And I think people don't really know how to create permission within themselves to accept what you just said, which is what you said was quite profound. I'm actually quite amazed. And it was that your story doesn't get deleted when you become a Christian.
Right.
You get to keep your story, but then now all of a sudden you have a savior who now all of a sudden repurposes things. And
Loves you in your story. Yes.
yeah, and I think if we do that, we're going to get stuck in the part of this. We're going to get stuck in our story. If because to your point, we can't live up, and we're probably gonna get into some strong denial. Like, let's say a person wants to create this narrative, and I had that. I remember I was a senior in high school when I became a Christian. I'll never forget. It makes me emotional thinking about it, but I was driving down the road, and I remember when I started first studying the Bible and coming to church, I remember thinking, I literally said this to myself. I go, I'm not gonna mess this up. Oh, boy, was I wrong. I have made some of the craziest decisions after I said Jesus is Lord. What's amazing is that we have Jesus doesn't leave. The gospel's messy. The Old Testament's messy. Corinth is messy. Thessalonica, everything is so messy. But
Yeah.
sometimes maybe when you're trying to elevate something for God, you do it in a way and you dismiss the mess. You can't dismiss the mess. That's the part that God's working through. And so I just love how you're talking about not deleting history.
Yeah.
Causes psychological problems too anyway. I love it.
Well, and I think so I think sometimes we do not give the Holy Spirit its due, right? And I think if we would all just sit at the feet of the Holy Spirit and beg for wisdom on an individual level instead of a generalistic level, then I think honestly we could set people up for success a little bit more as far as in the dating world, in the engagement world. Because I remember when my husband and I were when we started dating, we said we were not going to kiss until our wedding day. Now, no one, all of our mentors credit, no one told us to do that. No one was like, this is what's wisest. We chose that. And I feel really great about that decision because we both had stories that's what we wanted to do. Okay. And it was fine. What I did not feel great about is the other people around us who looked at our decision and felt less than because that wasn't their decision, or felt, like they were somehow sinful because that wasn't their decision. And at the time, I didn't really think much of it because, I was probably just enjoying that I was about to marry my favorite person. It was kind of like tunnel vision. But now looking back on that, I'm like, man, I wish I would have sat down with those people who were also dating and said, you know what, less than is not always holier. It's okay. It's okay. Like, this is my story. This is your story. If you've sat at the foot of the Holy Spirit and begged for wisdom, and these are the boundaries that they gave you, amen.
Lauren, can I share something with you?
Yeah.
So I remember when you were dating Craig, and I remember you were like you were the purity pedestal. Like, you just were. And I've debated whether or not to say this to you right now, but hey, this is awesome. I remember that. And I remember like you were, I can see it now. It was more internally motivated, but like you were kind of the way you dressed, you were super modest. I'm not going to get into your modesty, but you were very modest and you had strong convictions. And I do remember it's kind of like the person who's most austere or the most, whatever, that person does kind of get, because then it's like, well, if that person is doing that, then we kind of really raise the bar and then we can really keep people pure. And it's like, you kind of became the purity mascot, and not in a way like mascot in terms of like, poking fun or anything, but like, hey, this person is the example. And I think it's so amazing because in this moment, I don't know if you know, but there's probably people who needed to hear what you just said and who did know you. And you should have, I think in some ways though, you and Craig, you guys did an amazing job. My wife and I too, we waited to our wedding day to kiss or whatever. But at the same time, we had struggles here and there as well. And I definitely think that, to your point, we have to be careful about enjoying the pedestal,
Yeah.
and then come back around and do repair and say, hey, people, want to clarify some things. So I love that you said that. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate you being really authentic with that, because it is. I think we can have these top tier conversations that feel really intellectual, but the reality is this is real life. These are people's lives. And that's where I feel like the part of me that naturally wants to bristle and go, okay, well, if we're not going to be really intense about purity, then people are going to mess up and I feel protective of almost my church culture's theology, and not just the theology, but also the practical norms. Like, I feel protective of them out of fear. But the reality is that it would be nice if the generalization of purity culture, like saying, okay, no one should kiss until they're married, or no one should feel arousal, or, kind of these implicit generalities, if those had the intended consequence of preserving, creating happy, healthy marriages, right? Because we also know that promiscuity, sexual sin has consequences on marriage, right? And we hear about that a lot. Like, if you mess up, that can mess with your sexuality later when you're married. We hear about that. But it would be nice if the generalization also had the intended consequence that we want. But the reality, what that I see in my office is, unfortunately, it does not.
Wow.
It has these unintended consequences of couples who can't enjoy their sex life, couples who experience pain in their sex life, couples who fight about their sex life all the time. And even individual females. Earlier you spoke about, kind of this, the lack of sex positivity in the male conversation. And from the female perspective, I would push back and say it is just as prevalent.
I believe it. I really do. And it's sad.
It's sad. And honestly, I think women have this added layer.
Yeah.
And if you read books like Pure by Linda K. Klein, or Sex, God, and the Conservative Church by King Sellers, you'll see there's this added layer for females of, we are the keepers of the male purity. Like,
talk about it.
Our shoulders to be modest, to not move our bodies in a way that's seductive. And again, I'm not saying modesty or, being modest with our clothing or our movement is bad, right? I think all those things are great. But the reality is that we put this intense, and this is not just my church, this is the entire Christian, this intense pressure on females to be the keepers of male purity. And what that does is that makes it really difficult for women later to accept their husband's sexual attraction.
Oh my, okay, let's pause. That was like bars. Say that again.
Okay, so
Being a keeper of a male's purity makes it hard. What was that again?
It makes it hard. It can make it hard. It doesn't always, but it can make it hard for a married woman to receive her husband's sexual attention well. Because our implicit message is if someone is sexually attracted to you, you are doing something wrong.
Oh my goodness.
Or they are gross and they are unspiritual and they are not the guy you want to be around.
And yet the guys in the Bible, David, yeah, I don't think that would have, and so it's interesting. Oh my gosh, that is so enlightening. You know, it's interesting. People, you know, everyone kind of, there's a lot of talk about trauma, and I think that when you study trauma, you have to study the deeper patterns. And what you just nailed was a deeper pattern. At a subconscious level, people are trying to figure out why they feel the way they feel. And I think what you've just said creates a little bit of a link that they can now explore and get curious about has being sort of the gatekeeper of men's purity, has that cultivated in me something of a, not disgust, but a disgust at times, an implicit disgust. I think that's powerful, and I've never thought of that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's this internalization for women where we learn to, and this is true of men too, we learn to not trust our bodies, right? So when a wife starts to feel sexual arousal to her husband or feels that inclination to lean toward her husband sexually, right? Like, man, I just want to go snuggle them, or I just want to put my arm around them. They can feel this natural impulse to push away from them. And that can just be this internalized distrust of your body's instincts. It's interesting and it's sad. And again, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm not saying that, you know, women should wear whatever they want. And, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, women should just be able to do whatever they want and men should be able to do whatever, you know, not just like there is no truth. I don't want to go to that extreme at all. All I'm saying is I think we need to have a lot more conversation about it.
Well, isn't it interesting, Lauren, how we have to sort of just so often deep preface things? Like, it's almost like you can't even have a conversation anymore without people feeling like, it's almost like it's like people are in the extremes. Like even in this conversation, I was feeling like, okay, let's have this, right? I'm going to cover this. Like this is happening. And yet I was like, okay, some people are going to take this as purity bashing and other people are going to look at it as, oh my gosh, somebody finally gets it. And I want to start working towards healing. You just never know. And people are so reactive, people, you know, and so I just want to say for our audience, our listeners, you know, Lauren and I, we talked last night and we were just like, yo, we're not trying to bash anything, but it doesn't take hardly anything for someone to feel like you're just this person who just lost your mind. And I'm like, that's not at all what we're saying, but that's where people are sometimes. And that's what it is.
Yeah. Well, and you know, like we were talking about earlier, I think there's a part of me that really struggles with, man, am I qualified to have this conversation spiritually? Am I spiritual enough to have this conversation? Am I old enough to have this conversation? Do I have enough clinical acumen to have this conversation? And, you know, there's a big part of me that really didn't want to come today because I felt nervous about making people mad. I'm like, I don't want to do this. But then, you know, as I'm praying about it, I keep thinking about the couples in my office that feel unseen and unknown and alone. And man, that pushes me to say some of the things that might rock some boats, you know, just because I don't want them to feel alone anymore. And again, I don't have all the solutions. I'm not an expert in this area, but all I know is that what has come through my doors is a need for conversation.
Well, so one of the things that I'll just end with, we'll have one more question here. I think that's part of the thing, right? Safety is about being able to ask questions. Safety is about being able to have a conversation. One of the things that I think sometimes scripture can be used to do is shut down conversation, right? So, and that's how you keep people immature, is when you have these very surface generalized scriptural readings, interpretations, and then you just apply it. And it's interesting when Jesus is faced with this in the Gospels, Matthew, where he says, I will give you rest for your souls. And what he's really talking about is kind of different but similar, which is he's dealing with Pharisees who have these symbols of inefficiency, meaning they've made this entire system of how to worship God. And then Jesus comes along and says, check this out. You don't need any of that because that is horribly inefficient compared to what I am. I am Torah. So listening to me gets you closer to God than listening to them. And so let's get rid of all these symbols of inefficiency that weigh and burden you down anyway. What I'm almost hearing in this whole conversation as we bring it back to Jesus in scripture is let's be careful not to import our symbols of inefficiency into a purity culture, because what it's going to do really at the end of the day, and Jesus says this in John 10, I believe, that he came that we have life to the full. It robs people. There is a theft. And I hear the pain, Lauren. Like I'm looking at you right now and I, therapist to therapist, I know you know the pain. I know that you walk with people who are going to have maybe the next 10 years of their lives robbed from real enjoyment that they could have had. And this is like a little epidemic in some ways. I'm not saying we need to, start a hashtag or something, but I'm saying we got to be really careful how we import things into this. And I think there's just inefficiencies that when you generalize, you bring into the situation. So anyway, what do you want to say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, I appreciate your boldness. And honestly, when you were sharing it, it made me tear up because I see a lot of pain, and I see a lot of pain that is not going to be healed quickly. And that's just a reality. And it's really hard to watch people reckon with that. And it's really hard to watch people wrestle with the church because of it. And honestly, it's not a perfect analogy, but I like to think of sex in a marriage is like baptism in salvation. Okay, so obviously it's not a perfect analogy because we don't get baptized more than once, but it's a physical representation, physical manifestation of a covenant. God is literally present, right? We don't believe it's just a symbol, outward sign of an inward grace. God is literally doing things during this physical manifestation of the covenant. Now, just like we would not frivolously throw around baptism doctrine or avoid talking about baptism because it feels big, I believe that the Lord will hold us accountable for how we talk about sex and marriage to the same extent. Just like we wouldn't be frivolous about baptism, we cannot be frivolous about sexuality. And again, I don't know all the answers, but I do know that we have to be as careful talking about sexuality as we are about baptism, about some of these bigger issues in theology, because it really is, it's just as big.
Yeah, I mean, and if you're, for our Catholic audience, sex is one of the seven sacraments, right? Baptism is a sacrament, sex is a sacrament, Lord's Supper. What you just said actually has a lot of theological relevance and I think accuracy. So I know it seems like a loose analogy, but I think it's spot on. What do you want to share with us in terms of resources? My audience is always looking for resources, and I want to make sure that I send them with full baskets. So what do you want to share?
Yes. So if you are married and your sex life is not what you want it to be, I would encourage you to pick up, well, of course, I'm a little biased. I would encourage you to find a Christian sex therapist. I think that's step one. I would also encourage you to pick up a book called Restoring the Pleasure, which is by the Penners. And that is an incredible protocol that you can go through with your spouse to rebuild your sex life from square one. And it can help you kind of undo some of these internalized messages that may be kind of creating walls. Okay. If you're interested in learning more about purity culture, or maybe you're a minister and you're going, okay, how do I start these conversations? How do I learn more about this? Sex, God, and the Conservative Church is a fabulous book. Pure by Linda K. Klein is a great book, although I will say, that's a very individualistic experience book. Sex, God, and Conservative Church is a more broad kind of theological conversation about it. Dr. Konzen and her husband, Tim Konzen, have a book called The Art of Intimate Marriage, which I would also recommend for ministers and married couples. Incredible book. Again, I mentioned Redeemed Sexuality by the Konzens, as well as Soul Virgins by Doug Rosenau. It's a great resource for singles. I will say the Restoring the Pleasure book has a really wonderful table. It's really literally like a table that breaks down ages and conversations and the theological message that you want to send sexually for parents. And honestly, if you're a parent, even if your sex life is great, I would pick up that book just for that table. It is gold. So if you're a parent kind of wondering, okay, how do I have these healthy conversations with my kid that are sex positive, but also not promiscuous? How do I walk that line? That's a great book. Also, Tina Sellers, the author who wrote Sex, God, and Conservative Church, has a website. There's a wonderful PDF that's literally like a visual that can help parents kind of know what to talk about and when. Because I think a lot of parents are really scared. If I have this conversation too early, I'm going to over-sexualize my child, right? Or I'm going to expose them too early. The reality is that we are in a hyper-sexualized culture, and the church is under-sexualized as far as our conversation. So
Wow.
I promise most of the parents, you will not over-sexualize your children. The world will do that for them. So you are just having the conversation first, and you are dominating the narrative so that they understand their body is good, sex is good, and God has a great plan for their sex life.
I this is hilarious. I feel so blessed. I am serious. Having you on today was so good. And I thank you so much for your time. People don't realize this. You got a million things going on. You got a million. I mean, there's so much going on, and I appreciate you taking a pit stop today to bless the channel. This will absolutely equip people. I want to say to you what I say to all my people. We are with you. We really are, Lauren. And God is for you, my sister.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Well, if you've listened through the entire video, I want to thank you so much. This has been such a full experience today. Please like, share, and subscribe. I have incredible content continuously on the way. The people that I have coming on, I think, are just phenomenal, like Lauren, and I'm really looking forward to what's coming. I'll see you next time.